Hi everybody, Professor Gassimi here. In this video, I'm going to be taking you through the third homework assignment in the Web Application Development course. This assignment is the third and final part of the homework series regarding the development of your personal website. So to understand the purpose of this application and how it fits within the broader context of the homework, let's take a step back and discuss what we've already done to date. In homework 1, you used JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, and you built a simple, static, client-side web application. Then in homework 2, you augmented that by adding a database, and you used Jinja so that you could pull elements from that database related to your resume, and you could display it. As you can see, I've got here on the right-hand side the website open, the functional implementation. This is effectively what we did last time, right? We built this resume page using a combination of a database and Jinja. Okay, well, here's what's missing from that homework 2 implementation that exists in a lot of websites that you encounter in the wild and that you'll probably have to build if you make a career in this area. There was nothing about homework 2 that really used or involved session management. You didn't have to really deal with user authentication or password encryption. And the communication was a series of regular old HTTP requests. There wasn't really much asynchronous communication that was happening there. You didn't need to stream data to anyone. You didn't need to kind of pull a server for a response and then display it. Nothing of that kind. The purpose of this third homework assignment is to fill in some of those gaps. More specifically, my hope is that by the end of this homework assignment, you will have some experience with basic security, authentication, and asynchronous communication technologies for your web application. You should be very comfortable managing sessions, encrypting passwords, performing user authentication, and using some of the standard asynchronous communication technologies. AJAX, whether that's through Fetch or jQuery, and WebSockets specifically are the ones that we will go over in the homework. Now, with respect to the goals of this assignment, you're taking homework 2 and you're extending it to include 3 new systems. The first is an authentication system. This is going to allow your users to log in, to log out, and to gain access to restricted components of the web application. The second system you're going to be building is a chat system. So this is a place where if you're logged in and a guest user of your web application is logged in, then you all can engage in a live chat the way you would on WhatsApp or Facebook or any other kind of platform. Then the third item, and this one is optional, it's only if you're doing an honors option in the class, is an editable resume. Editable in the sense that if you're logged in as the owner of the site, your resume page should not just display the styled template of your resume, that beautiful kind of structured document that we saw here. You shouldn't just see this, but each of the elements here should be editable. Just like what you have in social media sites, right? You have a profile, you can edit attributes of the profile, so you'll want a similar kind of functionality here if you want to take the course for honors credit. Okay, now my objective in creating this video is to show you a functional implementation of these requirements first, and then I'm going to step you through some of the specific requirements. So let's first go through the functional implementation aspects. Let's start first with this authentication system up here, this first assignment goal. Here on the right-hand side, this page probably looks pretty familiar to you. It's the same old stuff that we covered in homework 2. There's only a difference of 2 tabs in the nav bar of this site. You can see them here. There's chat, this is new, and there's also login, this is new. Okay, well, the first one that we want to talk about is the authentication system. And what this is supposed to do is prevent people from accessing certain areas of the site that are restricted. In the case of this web application, actually the chat system is one such example of a part of the site that you can't access unless you're logged in. Here's how you know that. When I click chat, where does it redirect me to? Looking up here in the URL, it redirects me to the login page. That's the same, again, if I click login versus if I click chat. In both cases, it's just taking me to the login page. That's because to access chat, I have to be logged in first. Okay, well, so the authentication system is doing what it needs to do. It's blocking me from accessing the chat. Well, let's go ahead and try testing out some of the core features of an authentication system. So I might come here and I might put in some username and password, click submit, and if this is a bogus username and password, I need to get a message that tells me you failed. And in this case, I'm just going to count the number of authentication failures. We could, of course, make the messages slightly more sophisticated. Hey, your password's wrong, but the user exists, and so on. But for the purposes of this web application, we're going to keep it nice and simple. Okay, well, we've seen authentication failure. Now let's see what an authentication success looks like. Now, when I create this application, I actually create with it two users. I create someone called owner@email.com and I create guest@email.com. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to log in as one of those pre-created users. Here's owner@email.com and the password is simply password. Okay, and I'm going to click submit, and now you can see, oh, it redirected me to home. And what do you notice is different about this home page? Well, one thing that's different is up here in the top left, instead of saying it's the homework for the class, it says, hey, welcome, and it puts my email. Now notice that anywhere I go on this page, if I go to the projects page, if I go to the resume page, you know, this persists. This label here in the nav bar is persisting. Okay, so this is one aspect that you want to get done. Also notice that we built that authentication system to really guard access to this chat, right? We didn't want any random person coming into the chat functionality with us. Well, if I click this chat now, you can see I now get access to the chat room. And you can ignore this login here. This is just a small typographical error on my part. This should say chat. Okay, so I'm in the chat room though. And what you see here is that when I entered the chat room, I got one of these kind of, it's almost like a 90s style chat room, right? Owner@email.com has entered the room is what gets announced. Now there's nobody else in here, so this is probably pretty boring. I can come here, I can enter messages and nothing happens. Okay, so what we need to do is, in order for you to appreciate what this chat does, is we need another user. The way we're going to get the other user is I've got another browser open here. The one on the right is an incognito tab of Chrome, and this is Firefox. Now, these are two separate browsers. They have no way of exchanging information with each other. Okay, so this browser doesn't know what that browser is doing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to log in here as the other user that I created in the system. In this case, it's guest@email.com, and I'm going to put the password, and when I submit, hey, once again, now I'm logged in, but notice that here it says guest@email.com, whereas here on the right it said owner@email.com. Okay, well now I'm all logged in, that's great, and let's say I'm a guest and I want to chat with the owner. I've been invited, let's say, and I want to chat with the owner of the site. I'm going to come here to the chat tab, and what did you notice? That when I clicked this chat tab, the owner received a notification. It said that guest@email.com has entered the room. And this guest might say, or I as the owner might say, hi guest. And I would spell it right, hopefully. And what did you notice? That when I typed hi guest here on the right hand side, so too did that message show up on the left hand side. These are separate sessions in the two browsers, by the way. What's happening is these are both connected to the web server. There is a WebSocket that is responsible for transmitting information between these two sessions, the two client sessions, so that when I type in some message here, you can see it not only shows up in this user's chat window, but it's also showing up in this user's chat window. Pretty neat. Okay. There's some other functionality, of course, that we want to be able to enable, like in addition to being able to type messages here, we'd like it so that just like in a regular chat, the scroll bar kind of moves down, right, as I type more and more messages, more and more content in here. Okay, the other thing that we're interested in is we saw that an announcement is made when we enter the chat. We also want an announcement to be made when we leave the chat. So if I click leave chat here, what did you notice? I get booted out and it says, hey, owner at email has left the room. Okay, so if you understood these two things that I just took you through, you've actually got all of the assignment goals taken care of. That's everything. The rest of this video is me very succinctly and quickly taking you through some of the procedural elements when you work on the assignment. And in addition to those procedural elements, I would like to take you through some of the specific requirements that are going to be expected of you. It's basically what I showed you here on the right-hand side, but I'm going to call it out specifically with you as we go through the video. Okay, so there's some of these standard logistical things that we always do at the start of a homework, right? You update a copy of your course materials repository. You should know how to do this. You compose the homework container locally. I've included a new homework 3 Docker file with some additional libraries above and beyond what we used in homework 2. And then just like last time, I have shipped a template web application. It's right here on the right. And I strongly encourage you to explore this template application. It is functional. You can take it, compose it, and it will work. But of course, it's a skeleton, right? You'll have to take the components of your homework 2. You'll have to transfer those in and kind of build this out. I'd still like to take you through some of the components here together, though. So let's start with each of the items in order. The first one is under database, there is a create table. You remember this from homework 2. There was these create tables, experience, feedback, institutions, positions, and so on. The only thing that's changed here is that I added a users table creation. And what does this do? Well, it creates a table if it doesn't exist users. It puts a role, an email, and a password in there. The primary key is this user ID. And this is where we're going to store the user information. Okay, so this is already created for you. Now, if we're going to store something in the users table, we're obviously going to have to modify our database utility. So coming down here to utils database, let me scroll down here so it's all aligned. Perfect. There's a couple of new sections here as well. Let me go ahead and show you that real quick. I'm going to give us a little bit of space so that you can see, I'm going to open this up. Hopefully then you can see it more effectively. Okay, great. A lot of this stuff are things that you had from before, and I actually included some of my own implementations for inserting rows and creating tables from homework 2. You should already have those developed, but if you don't, you're actually welcome to use these. The pieces that you're going to focus on in this homework are authentication related, and you can see I've denoted that with this big text comment block, authentication related here in the code. Specifically, there is a create users function that you're going to populate here. There is an authentication function that you're going to populate. And then there's two functions that I've included that perform one-way encryption using the scrypt encryption utility and performs reversible encryption using Fernet. Now, example usage-wise, the way that this one-way encryption works is you call it, you pass it a string, it gives you an encrypted string. Reversible encrypt, you call it, you tell it whether you want to encrypt or decrypt, and it takes whatever message you passed and it either encrypts it or it decrypts it, okay? You might notice that this calls some of the things from up here in init. These are some of the parameters of the encryption, such as what salt we want to use in the encryption algorithm, some of the other parameters in scrypt's case, and then the particular key we're going to use for the reversible encryption. Okay? So this covers everything within the database. Remember, you will be working on these first two, create user and authenticate, and I'm going to talk you through as we move down here what specifically you're going to be creating there. Let's move on now to app.py. Okay, app.py is pretty much the same as what you had before, but there's been a couple of very minor modifications. The minor modification is here up at the top. We are importing from our Flask app, which is specified in init.py, which we'll go through in a minute. we're importing SocketIO, and we're running SocketIO instead of the app formally. The reason for this is because SocketIO uses a slightly different method for communication than regular old HTTP requests and responses does. And so when you're creating the application, you're actually technically creating a SocketIO application, not a regular old Flask application anymore. Okay, so that's app.py. Let's go to init.py. The only thing we've added here is we call out that we want to import SocketIO. This is an extension within Flask. It basically wraps SocketIO, which itself wraps WebSockets for you, so that you have an easier way of building sort of a real-time communication application. There's a couple of things here that have been created that I'd like to call out. The first one is that, remember how I had an owner and a guest at email.com? The reason I had those when I first started the application is because here I specified their creation. So when I start up the application, I just create those two users, owner at email.com and guest at email.com. Note that in the template I've given you, the code to take these inputs and insert into the database is blank. Okay, so you still have to fill in this create user function in the database. I already took you through that. It will take an email and a password and a role, and it will generate the user. You don't have to do it this way. I did it here for convenience. You could also load the information within a CSV as an example, just like we did in homework 2. The tricky thing is that it's kind of a bad practice to store your passwords within text files, right? You would ideally, if you were creating an application like this, you would create a user like owner at email.com. You'd have some password here, and then the first time that the owner logs in, you would force them to reset that password. That's probably how you would deal with this, so that the actual password of the owner never shows up anywhere within the web application in any kind of static file. That's the right way to handle it. Again, for illustrative purposes, I've created these two. It'd be slightly different if you were having real users sign up, of course. Okay, let's go to routes.py. So routes.py, you should be familiar with this. What I've done is, here at the top, I've included all the import statements that I used in my code. And you shouldn't need to import other things. If you want to, you're welcome to. You can add to your requirements.txt. If you want to use other things as you build stuff here, that's totally fine. But I included everything that I used as I was building the application. I've also partitioned this routes.py up into some sections that are related to the specific homework component. You can see there's this authentication related block here, and then there is a chat room related block towards the middle of the page there. Okay, let me go ahead and try to take you through first some of the components in authentication, and then we'll move over to the chat room. So within authentication, the first thing is this login required function. This is what allowed us, when we clicked the chat earlier, you remember how it redirected us to login? Well, that's what this line does here. You see line 22? It says, if I don't see an email within the user session, so it checks the session variable. Remember, that's the cookie that gets sent by the web application, and I can put whatever I want inside that cookie. So within that cookie, I might put the email of a user that's logged in as an example. And if I don't see that, an indicator for their email inside that cookie that gets sent with each HTTP request, then I'm going to say, well, fine, you must not be logged in, so I'm going to redirect you to the login page. Okay, I left this here fully implemented for you. I don't think it's too critical that you learn how to implement this. I think this example is more than enough. Also note that I also included this instance of the decorator class. I attached it here. So by adding @login required underneath the app.root/chat, this is what allows that functionality that you saw. Okay, you could add this @login required to any of the other routes, and it would also prevent them from being accessed without a login. Okay, great. So moving down the list, the next thing I want to take you through is this login route. Well, what you can see is this is what's rendering the template login.html. So remember, I clicked over here. When I clicked this, let me log out and come to login. When I click this page, basically that's what the login route is rendering. Okay, and then there's a log out. And what this does, I've left implemented for you, but you may have to modify, is it takes the session that is contains the email. That's how we know someone's logged in. And it throws it out and then redirects them to home. Now this process login, this last piece is important. And I should note that everything that you see here is not completely baked. It's a template. You will work with it to try to get it to a state where it has the full functionality. And there's details I've included in the assignment for all that. Okay, to be very clear, this process login, this is what's called when I click the submit button. So very specifically, when I click submit, a post request is generated and it's sent to the web application and processed by this process login. That's why methods post is enabled here. Okay, so a form is sent in the request. And what I'm doing here is I'm opening up that form and I'm just converting it to a dictionary. That's what form fields are. And then I'm grabbing the email field, that's this one, whatever was typed in here, and I'm storing it in the sessions email. That's how I know that someone's logged in. Now, obviously what I've got here is really dumb because it's not actually checking if my email is valid or not, right? It doesn't go to the database and say, hey, let me authenticate. Let me see if you're a real user or not. It doesn't do any of that. It just takes whatever's in the field and it throws it in the session. Okay, you'll obviously want to modify this so that it performs the real authentication process, and there's more details about that in the write-up. Okay, let's come down here to the chat section now. And we're almost done with this. So notice that here in chat, it's pretty simple. It just renders a template, chat.html. That's for the chat page that you saw. Okay, that's this one. Let me pull it up. That's this chat page. And this SocketIO decorated field for joined, this is what's responsible for generating the message, user has entered the room. Okay, to be very clear, in the template I sent you, SocketIO is working, and when a user enters the chat room, it will broadcast using this emit function to the chat room that the user has entered the room. Okay, in order for me to kind of open up on how this chat functionality works, the missing piece here is chat.html, right? Because someone visits this chat route, they see chat.html, and then chat.html is the one that's using the communication with SocketIO to do this broadcasting of the message. Okay, so this route calls chat.html, which is what's using this SocketIO decorated instance of joined in order to broadcast the messages. Let's go take a look at that over here. In templates, we've got chat. Okay, so I've included a extraordinarily simple basic implementation. It is functional, and it contains all the core things you would need in order to do a chat. Okay, so more specifically, I've got here remember, this is extending the layout.html, and layout.html allows us to insert a block for our main content that's down here. It's a very simple, it's just a div with ID chat, and then another place where I can input my message. And then here in the main body, I've got the JavaScript. This is the JavaScript that handles communication with socket.io. You can see I import from the CDN socket.io and I import jQuery, and I use these to connect basically to the chat route. I turn on the socket, and I'm able to use some code to when a status message is generated. Let me switch back. I want to close the loop here real quick. Okay, let me come over here. There we go. Okay. So you see this namespace chat, right? This namespace chat is what's responsible for how SocketIO, it knows what to connect to on the other side. Okay, and then more specifically, this says that when there is a status operator that occurs, let me come back over here. Let me show you here real quick. Okay, status, when a status message is emitted, you see that status, that matches. When that happens, I want this function to take care of the data that's transmitted back. And so whatever got attached to that status emission, again, let me hop back here to routes. See how there was a status emission and then there was some data. You see this data that was sent back. It contains a message and it contains a style, right? This information, coming back to chat, that's the data, okay? And so then what I'm able to do here is use that data, the message piece, to create a text node. And I basically append that text node with some styling within this div here. Okay, that's how when someone enters the chat room, I'm able to display the message. Okay, and this scroll top just forces the view to always be at the bottom of that area. Okay, this should certainly, I think, be enough to get you started with how to formally and syntactically structure the communication between the client and the backend via SocketIO, which is why I decided to include it here for you. I didn't want you to struggle as much with the syntax if it can be avoided. In a similar way, here in login.html, I've actually included a script that shows how you can check the credentials, or at least call a process login, generating the post request and sending some data. In this case, it's using jQuery's AJAX. You don't have to use jQuery. You can use fetch, which is native to JavaScript. There's some advantages actually to using fetch, given that it's native and you don't have to import a CDN. It was just a quick thing for me to write this in AJAX. So you can use whichever one you want, either the method that I'm showing here or fetch. Okay, now let's come back to chat. So I think that covers everything in chat.html. And I also took you through login.html. Okay, again, these are functional. They will work. It doesn't have all the pieces built out. But the major thing here is learning how you sort of get the JavaScript kind of communication piece working, and then you should be able to modify it from there, is my hope. So this template should help with that. Okay, so once you've got some familiarity with what I've shown here on the right-hand side, I suggest that you migrate your homework 2 to homework 3. Because remember, this is supposed to extend it. So the way you should do that is take any of your templates, take your static directory, any relevant files, and kind of move them into homework 3. I suggest that if you want to do it the other way, which is to try to take pieces from homework 3 and use it to migrate into homework 3 and migrate it into homework 2, the major thing you will want to be aware of is this init.py and app.py. These are sort of the major items that if you don't account for them and some of the import statements and routes, it could cause problems. So if you want a way to do it where there's guaranteed to be no bugs, you should migrate from homework 2 into homework 3. You can also go the other direction if you're feeling up to potentially a little bit of debugging challenges. Okay, so that gives you an overview of what's shipped out in the template. You can run this web application, and it's not going to look like the completed version that I showed you, but it'll have all the same core functionalities required for you to build out on. As you know, when you're doing these homework assignments, there's some general requirements regarding good programming practice. So keep your code neat. Don't mix HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. I know I've done that in some of these templates just to make it easy for you to see everything. When you're creating it for your submission, you should separate it out. Be neat with your SQL, your Jinja, and so on. Of course, you can see the assignment rubric for exactly how many points are allocated for each of these general requirements, as well as the specific requirements I'm about to take you through right now. Okay, let's go through these. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is build your authentication system. All right, and within this authentication system build, there's really two major tasks. The first one is extending the database utility to support sensitive data storage and authentication. So let's come back to our database utility. Let's scroll down to the area where the authentication related content is. Okay, there's two things we'll need to do here. The first is we'll need to modify create user so that it can create database entries for users given an email, a password, and a role. And that role should either be guest or owner. The function should also only add a user to the database if they do not already exist, so no matching email. And you'll want to make sure that you encrypt that password using scrypt. You can do that pretty simply by calling this one-way encrypt function that I've included here for you. Or you can do it on your own. It's up to you. Note that in order to use this for some other purposes, part of good practice is to have it return a status message that says whether the requested action succeeded or failed. So you'll want to make sure you do that for create user. Authenticate is should be a pretty straightforward one. You basically want to check if a given email and encrypted password combination exist in your database. And also similarly, this should return a success or failure notice. This is going to be really critical because based on what this authenticate function tells you, you're going to choose whether you grant someone a session later or not. Okay, so now let's come to enabling the login and logout functionality. For that, we're going to go to routes. And okay, the first one you'll want to build, I suggest, is login. So specifically, you'll want to build out login.html by extending what I showed you here. Okay, this will already make the AJAX communication to process login. It will return some data, and you can use console.log or whatever if you want. And I'm showing you how to redirect from within JavaScript. So I put again some of the pieces here for you. My hope is that it'll make it easy to extend and get the homework done. We already discussed process login, but let me come back to it and make a couple notes. That's this one. Just notice here that it is configured to process a post request containing, it should contain credentials for authentication in the form. And then you'll need to use the database authenticate method that we just described earlier to perform that authentication. And if success is 1, you want to grant the session that you see here. If success is 0, you don't want to grant it. Okay. I've given some examples for how you can store information, encrypted information within the session, which I'm not doing here. A last note here, it's critical, although you're welcome to make any modifications to this, it is critical if you want to avoid some nasty bugs to make sure that when you are returning back that you wrap the content that is returned in this json.dumps. In this case, again, I've statically written success is 1, but you're going to modify this so that it returns either success 1 or success 0 for failure. And then obviously your login screen can react based on that message to, for instance, indicate whether the authentication success was a go or a no-go. Okay, we already discussed logout, which is meant to pop email from the session. So this is effectively complete. And then we discussed layout.html. So we'll skip over that. Okay, chat room requirements. Let's just go through some of the items here. I did mention some of this earlier, so I think I'm going to just blaze through it. This chat route renders to chat.html. That's this one. Chat.html attaches a socket, okay, which can communicate back to, let's come over here, communicates back to here. And remember, when you have something through a WebSocket, unlike those AJAX requests where it happens one time on call, this one will stream any information that hits it back to the client. Okay, that's really the difference between when you're using a WebSocket versus when you're using just a regular old AJAX call through jQuery or Fetch. Okay, and I think that covers pretty much all of the code here. Hopefully this review will make it easier to approach some of the elements of this assignment. Last thing I want to note here is that if you're taking the class as an honors option, and only if you're taking it as an honors option, do you need to complete this editable resume section. That's where you will come back here to your resume, and you'll make it so that I've not implemented it, to be clear, but you'll want to have something like what I see here, except that I can edit the contents that is shown on the resume page, save them, and it will persist for the next person who visits. Okay, when you've done that, you've completed the assignment. You can submit it the usual way by adding, committing, and pushing to your personal course repository and deploying your application to Google Cloud. And of course, don't forget to submit the Homework 3 survey.